Welcome to the Iron John podcast. In this episode, we hear Paul Bendix speak on his nearly 2 decades as a participant at the Minnesota Men's Conferences. Paul is the author of the book Dance Without Steps. Paul was a full participant at our conferences, despite having to navigate with his wheelchair. Here's Paul.
I went to the conference the first time in, I think it was 1996, and it certainly came at a very low ebb in my life. I mean, I'd gotten divorced several years earlier, and around that time I had almost simultaneously broken my hip, had some complications of my spinal cord injury where I lost some use of my shoulder and right arm. I'd gone bankrupt. What on earth had I done? I mean, just everything seemed to go wrong. But somehow I got and I was also making a transition to a wheelchair. I'd been sort of semi-ambulatory before then. I mean, I had been ambulatory. I sort of hobbled around, but I couldn't do that anymore. So I was getting used to a power wheelchair, and I somehow got myself to Minnesota and the conference. I guess any good conference has a kind of a heightened atmosphere, it's a temporary convergence of a whole bunch of people with similar interests and I guess more or less similar sensibilities and so on. The conference, founded and then every year run by Robert Bly, was it was full of poetry, and that's one of its defining features. It didn't really matter who was speaking, who was the guest, who was the sort of star. Poetry defined it. In my day-to-day life, I don't have much poetry, and once I got there, I was always aware of how much I missed it. And I was reminded within a few hours, and then of course over the days and the 5 days that these conferences lasted, of the power and the music and the transcendent qualities of poetry and language. I remember a poem by Tim Young, and to say I remember it doesn't really do the word justice. I mean, I will never forget this very simple poem about getting up very early in the morning on, I guess, a small farm, and his wife had to take a prized calf into slaughter. Wonderfully effective, because the poem is just full of all these things moving in the same direction at the same moment. Calf, whom the wife loves, is about to be killed. She speaks to it affectionately. It's dawn, the day is beginning. There's just a heightened quality toward taking all that in. And I must have heard the poem certainly more than once. And here, almost 30 years since I first heard it, or maybe 25 years, whatever, I remember it. To me, it's emblematic of the experience. There were always featured speakers. Some were, to me, I just kind of tuned into them more effectively than others. Let me try to remember. And by the way, in the years I was attending the conference, my life went through all sorts of changes. I got married. I met a quite wonderful woman who, and we had just a wonderful life together. Then she got very serious cancer, and she was dying. And I remember about 7 months before Marlu's death, I was at the conference, and the guest that year, that one of the featured speakers, was Robert Moore, who was a Jungian analyst from Chicago. And I just heard him talk, and I just stood up during the talk and said that I was in this situation. My wife was dying, and I'm just glad I was there. I don't know what he said. He just kind of took it in. But after his talk was over, I went up to him, I don't know what to say. And, I said, what do I do? And he said, look me in the eye. So I did. And he said, You have already been through a lot. You have more to go through. You can do it. That moment was more than 20 years ago. Again, that's just a moment I'll never forget. Why it was so effective, I don't quite know. I mean, that's all that happened, just that. But I was in the presence of someone who affected me in this profound way, in this profound moment. Another guest was Edward Tick. Ed Tick is the author of a book called War and the Soul. I think he still has an institute called the Wounded Warriors Project. And we focused for those 5 days on wounded warriors, that is to say, the effects of war on the men who were at the conference. I really had never heard war stories in the way that I heard them there, but this is an experience that is not mine. But I just gained insight. It broadened my perspective on war and what it does. So I'll never forget him. James Hillman was quite a remarkable character. He, of course, was a very famous Jungian analyst, or as he described himself, a recovering Jungian analyst. He's a very intellectual man. His approach is much more mental, or whatever the word is. He is less apparently emotional and intuitive, but he also had a very powerful effect on me. Kipnis, I think his name was Aaron Kipnis. He is another Jungian. I'm not even sure if he's an analyst. I know he's associated with the Pacifica Institute in Santa Barbara, but he's kind of an expert on dealing with young men and the anger of young men. So I remember him. I remember him well. The conference was physically an enormous challenge for me, but it was always rewarded. For example, we did singing every morning. I think the singing began at some astonishing hour. Was it 7 a.m. or was it 6:30 a.m.? It was one or the other. And it was in the basement of the main building when the conference was at Sturgeon Lake. And the leader was a guy named Doug Von Koss. Doug, who recently turned 90, no longer does these things, but for years he was the singing master. And we would gather in this dark basement where Doug had candles out in a circle, and somehow I would go down the stairs. Some guys would always help me kind of hobble to a seat, and I would sit down and participate. Doug had this uncanny ability to just bring out the latent singer in everyone, and we just did incredible stuff, wonderful harmonies, everything from Gregorian chant to spirituals to stuff that he just knew. He had an endless program of songs. It was very hard, and then I would sometimes get myself back up this long flight of stairs, back in my wheelchair, and have breakfast. Some people came in from the outside, and the food could be quite wonderful. So there was daily singing, always poetry, always various activities I couldn't take part in, but I was kind of gamely turned up anyway. And then near the end of the 5 days, there was some kind of ritual. The idea behind it was to remind us, help us remember what we couldn't remember. And that is something that's kind of been lost in the culture. And that is that young men have some kind of just natural drive to kind of prove their courage. It is probably almost biological. In fact, I'm sure it is. This is how the human species has survived. People were driven to hunt and fish and then later farm. All of this took courage. Young men, especially, adolescent young men, need to have something that gives them a chance to demonstrate their courage to themselves and to their peers. So let's just assume that it's a natural drive. The drive can be handled in essentially one or two ways. It can kind of be ignored, in which case some bad things happen, or it can be acknowledged and channeled. And for millennia, people have understood what this is about, and they've channeled it. There are kind of two components. One, young men went through an ordeal of some kind, a test of their courage. And two, and this is important, they were, after they had done this and proven themselves, they were welcomed back to the village, the society, the camp, whatever was home. And both components are important, and the fact of that importance came to me from another one of the teachers who was there just 1 year, Michael Mead, who's a writer and also a thinker in the tradition, or whatever it is. Anyway, ordeal, then welcoming back. Those two things comprise kind of a complete cultural mechanism that channels the feisty, rebellious, aggressive energies of young men into ways that work for society in a positive way. If those energies are left to sort of express themselves, then we see it in a very, very negative example. We talk about youth gangs in America. I mean, it could be that this is a way, not a positive way, that young men kind of prove their courage to their peers and are, quote, welcomed, unquote. It's obviously a bad way to do this. And you can see there are two things absent. One is the absence of elders. One is the absence of a broad communal welcoming back, and so on. And if there's one kind of new idea I took home from my almost 2 decades of attendance, men who need to prove they're macho. It's a destructive force, and I think it's one of the most constructive ideas that I got out of attending the men's group. And it's kind of uncanny the way this idea just came up in different ways from different men and over many years, and it just all ended up really, converging on this one thing. There is a need to channel these energies, and if they're not kind of included in the culture in a healthy way, they find unhealthy expression. And I see that all around me. Late in my experience with the men's conference, a couple of things happened. Well, several things happened. One is I got more disabled. In fact, that was kind of a steady experience throughout. Robert Bly got ill and then was present less and less at the conferences, and finally wasn't present at all. Leaving, what? Well, that was very interesting because, one of the early years without Robert Bly, I remember there was a panel. We were discussing something or other, and there were 3 people, none of them particularly expert, but whatever the topic was, it really struck me that just within the men, particularly the ones who had been there for a number of years, there was some wisdom. And these 3 guys, whose names I still can't remember, talked about whatever they talked about. And I realized, wow, this is much more than Robert Bly and his friends. This is what it is. There's something here. And without Robert, there is plenty of life and energy and future here. It really hit me hard. It was quite a wonderful moment. Looking back on my experience with the conference, I'm trying to think of what I really have taken away. What's the most important thing? I guess I, in a broad sense, have understood the importance of thinking of myself as political animal, a member of the polis, of the community of people who govern and are governed, and the importance of having a strong voice and using it, and being in touch with other people who understand this. I had a little more confidence in myself as an elder, someone who brings value just by dint of experience, let's say, and even a bit of wisdom. The conference always had a tremendous range of ages, and I came to respect everyone's stage. There were young men, quite a number of them. Some years there were men as young as 14, and of course as old as 80 or older. And I learned that I've got my place in the march of ages, and it's important for me to use my voice when I see an opportunity, and to believe in the worthwhileness of speaking out. I recall going to the conference with a certain amount of grief because I can no longer go there. And as for the grief itself, a couple of things. I remember Robert Bly saying at some point that grief was something that he kind of felt was particular to American men, although, really something that men tended to hold in general. Holding grief actually is a very important human thing, and maybe because it speaks to vulnerability, it's something that isn't as culturally acknowledged as it should be. There is a grief that people have, but there's a particular grief that men have. I'm not sure I can say anything more than that, but in other words, I'm not alone. I can no longer go to the conference because I've just become too disabled, although I haven't completely given up hope. I do have an idea about how I might do it again, but in any case, it's become much more difficult. And, I grieve the loss of being able to attend. Robert Bly speculated that this particular American grief might have something to do with the loss of frontier, but that's just a speculation. Whatever it is, people who attend this conference, understand that this kind of is something that it's part of life, and it's okay. And poetry in particular is a good medium for grief. It's a good way to carry grief. It's a good way to express it, and that's been very, very useful for me. Because although I have my particular grief, I'm not alone. This is one of the sort of background themes, maybe even foundational themes about the conference. Storytelling was a very important part of the conference. I'm thinking of Martine Prechtel, wonderful storyteller. Michael Mead's a fine storyteller. These men invariably told their stories with some kind of rhythmic accompaniment. That's a very powerful tool. Also, there's a concept that I've never heard anywhere else, at least never expressed the same way, which is the idea of feeding the story. Means discussing the story, speculating about what had happened, what might happen, whatever it is, getting involved, critiquing, or just wondering, but in some way having something to say about it, as though there's something nurturing in that, as though the story has its own life and its own collective life, and we, the audience, are not just an audience, we're part of the telling of the tale, even though we're not technically telling it. That's a kind of wonderful notion, powerful one. In the years of my attendance at the conference, the internet came into being. Really, it was barely there when I started in 1996, and of course it's everywhere now. There was virtually no computer access in the early days. I suppose it's changed by now. I would guess that by now there's just a shared understanding that, we try not to use our phones. I say this as though I'm still attending, but that, you minimize your electronic experience and even contact with the outside world. One thing about the conference is that, having a disability, I never felt that help was very far away. People were always there to help me. And it was never not only not an issue, I didn't even really think about it. And I needed a fair amount of help. I still do. But somehow everyone kind of just got the idea, and this was kind of a shared experience, and it made my experience possible there. It also made it easy. I wasn't kind of, always wandering around asking for help. And, I realized that this is a kind of, interaction. People are never quite sure how much help I need or want. But we kind of worked it out, collectively early in the conference. It was more than just the story of going up and down the stairs to the morning singing. It was just all kinds of things like getting food at meal times, the idea of not having to even really think very much about seeking or receiving help. It kind of just worked out very, very, very smoothly. I guess when I think about the future of the conference, I hope that there's some way of finding a kind of a permanent source of stable funding. I mean, that's true of any nonprofit enterprise. This one probably no different from many others, but it's a long-term project. It's a multi-generational project.